The envelope was already open when Maren Collier found it on the kitchen table that Tuesday morning in March of 2019. She stood there in her barn coat, mud still drying on her boots from the 4:30 feeding, and looked at the thing the way you look at a snake that's already crossed the room. The letter inside had been placed back carefully, fold lines lined up, as if whoever had read it first wanted her to think it had been left untouched. But the wax seal, the little amber circle she had pressed there herself with her grandmother's ring, was cracked clean through. Someone had read what was inside. And Maren already knew who. She picked the letter up and held it at the window where the gray Kentucky morning was just starting to separate itself from the dark treeline of Barren County, and she read the number at the bottom of the page one more time. $280,412. Net. The figure sat there in plain ink below the name of her accountant, Wallace Greer, who had added in his own handwriting at the bottom, "I've been doing this work for 31 years and I want you to know I've never been happier to sign my name." Maren set the letter down. She looked out at the frost-stiffened pasture where her Katahdin ewes were beginning to move toward the gate, their breath rising in white threads above the brown grass. There is a kind of silence that follows a long war's ending. Not peaceful exactly. More like the air after a bell stops ringing, still vibrating with something that hasn't quite dissolved. This is that kind of story. The kind where the ground wins. Where the woman who was told she was wrong about everything turns out to have been right about the one thing that mattered most. But you can't understand what that number meant to Maren Collier in March of 2019 without going back to a different March, 5 years earlier, and a different piece of paper, and a room full of men who had trouble keeping the smiles off their faces. She had been 34 years old in March of 2014. She had been sitting in a folding chair inside the Barren County Agricultural Extension Office in Glasgow, Kentucky, and a county agent named Dale Hauser had been drawing on a whiteboard with a blue marker, explaining to her, slowly, with the deliberate patience of someone explaining a difficult concept to a child, why her business plan was not viable. Maren had her hands folded on top of a manila folder in her lap. Inside the folder were 2 years of research. Heritage breed profiles. Pasture rotation schedules. Soil amendment plans based on 4 separate sample tests from her grandmother's 47 acres on Tompkinsville Road. A 3-year cash flow projection built from actual market data she had pulled from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture and cross-referenced with grass-fed beef and lamb premiums from distributors in Nashville and Louisville. A letter of interest from a regional co-op. A second letter from a restaurant group in Bowling Green that had been trying, unsuccessfully, for 2 years to source heritage pork within a 100-mile radius. Dale Hauser had not asked to see any of it. He had glanced at the folder when she walked in and then he had looked at the whiteboard and he had talked for 22 minutes about overhead ratios and processing costs and the challenges facing small operations, all of which Maren already knew, had already accounted for, had already built into the conservative column of her projections. When he finally stopped, he turned to her with a look that was not quite kind and not quite dismissive but lived in the uncomfortable territory between the two. "Mrs. Collier," he said, "grass-fed operations require significant capital infrastructure. The pasture rotation model you're describing, for 3 separate species simultaneously, that's not something a single operator can manage." "Not realistically." Maren asked if he would look at her folder. He said he appreciated her preparation. He did not look at the folder. There was another man in the room. Lon Breckett, a loan officer from the Farm Credit Office on the square, who had been brought in because Maren had applied for a $30,000 operating loan 3 weeks earlier and had not yet received a response. Lon Breckett had a styrofoam cup of coffee and he had not said a single word the entire time. He said one word now. Denied. Maren drove home on Route 68 through a sleet that hadn't made up its mind to be rain, and she pulled into her grandmother's gravel drive, and she sat in the truck with the engine running for a long time, looking at the barn. Her grandmother, Celia Fay Collier, was 81 years old and had been running cattle on those 47 acres since before Maren was born. Not profitable cattle, the last several years. Celia Fay's knees had given out the previous summer, and the place had the particular sadness of a farm in slow retreat, fences that needed one more season of attention, a hay feeder with a rusted corner, a pasture that hadn't been rotationally grazed in a decade and showed it. But the land itself was good. Maren had known it since childhood, had walked every contour of it, had understood in some preverbal part of her that those rolling limestone underlain fields in south-central Kentucky were capable of something specific and extraordinary if anyone would simply let them do what they were built for. She had come back to the farm 18 months earlier after a decade in Louisville, where she had worked in restaurant supply chain management and spent her evenings reading everything she could find about heritage breeds, regenerative grazing, and the growing premium market for pasture-raised protein. She had come back because Celia Fay needed someone and because Maren had felt, for a long time, that her actual life was waiting for her somewhere else than a cubicle with a window view of a parking structure. She had not expected it to be easy. She had not expected to be told it was impossible. There is a specific loneliness in being the only person in a room who has done the reading. Maren knew the research. She knew that multi-species rotational grazing, properly managed, with the right breeds, could actually improve pasture health over time rather than degrade it. She knew that Katahdin sheep and Tamworth pigs and a small herd of grass-finished beef cattle were not three separate problems for one woman to solve, but one integrated system in which each species served the others. The sheep moved first, grazing the top third of the grass. The cattle followed, working the middle. The pigs came last, rooting the soil just enough to break compaction and seed in fresh growth, and their manure completed a fertility cycle that made synthetic fertilizer largely unnecessary. She had not invented this model. She had studied it for 2 years, had visited 3 operations in Tennessee and 1 in southern Ohio, had spoken by phone with a rancher in Missouri who had been running a version of it for 11 years. She knew it worked. What she did not yet know was what it would take to make them see it. After that March meeting, Maren sold the one thing of value she still owned outright, a 2011 pickup truck, which she traded for an older model and pocketed $11,000. She went to her grandmother's kitchen table that evening and she laid out what she had, and Celia Fay, who had not offered an opinion yet, looked at the numbers and set her coffee cup down with the quiet deliberateness of someone making a decision. "My father started with 6 ewes," Celia Fay said. Everybody thought he was a fool too. That was the last thing either of them said about it for a long time. Maren spent the rest of that spring and the early part of the summer doing the work that didn't require borrowed money. She walked every fence line on the 47 acres with a notebook and cataloged what needed fixing versus what needed replacing. She pulled soil samples from 8 separate zones across the property and sent them to the University of Kentucky Extension Lab, not to Dale Hauser's office, but to the lab directly, and paid for the analysis herself. She mapped the natural water movement across the farm after a 2-inch rain event in late April, standing in the pasture in rubber boots as the water sheeted off the upper field and found its old channels, and she drew what she saw, and then she drew what she wanted. The land, she kept telling herself, is the business plan. The land already knows what it wants to do. In July, she drove to a farm sale in Metcalfe County and bought her first 4 Katahdin ewes. Katahdins are a hair sheep, they shed their fleece naturally without shearing, and they had been developed specifically for the humid climate of the American South, where wool sheep struggle. They were hardy, parasite-resistant to a degree that most breeds weren't, and they finished on grass in a way that produced meat with a clean, mild flavor that the premium restaurant market had been asking for. The 4 ewes cost her $900 total. She loaded them into a borrowed trailer and brought them home in the back of the older truck, and she stood in the barn that night listening to them move around in their new stall, and she had the feeling, she would describe it later to Celia Fay, of having started something that could not be unstarted. The summer passed. The work was physical in a way that reorganizes a person. Her hands changed. Her shoulders changed. She was up at 4:15 every morning and in bed before 9 most nights, and in the spaces between she was reading, calculating, adjusting. She discovered that the North Pasture's soil had a pH problem she hadn't fully accounted for, and she spent 2 weekends in September spreading agricultural lime, borrowing a spreader from a neighbor named Harold Tate, who was 73 and had farmed adjacent land for 40 years and who watched her work without commentary for most of an afternoon before finally saying that he hadn't seen somebody work a field that carefully in a while. Harold became the first person to believe in what she was building. Not because she convinced him with an argument, but because he watched her do the work. He lent her equipment without being asked when he figured she needed it. He said nothing about it. That was its own kind of language. The first lamb was born on a Wednesday in February of 2015, a cold morning with ice on the water troughs, and Maren was in the barn before dawn because she had been watching the lead-ewe for 3 days and knew the signs. She sat in the straw in her coat and her headlamp and she watched the lamb come into the world in the dark barn, and she felt something settle in her chest that hadn't been settled in a long time. By April she had 6 lambs on the ground. By June, all 6 were gaining weight on grass alone, and the condition of her pasture, to anyone who knew what to look for, had already started to improve. She sold her first lamb that August. A restaurant in Bowling Green, the same one that had sent the letter of interest the previous year, bought a whole carcass at a price per pound that was almost 3 times the commodity rate. The chef sent a text message that said simply, "When can you do this again?" Maren stood in the kitchen and read that text message 4 times. Then she walked out to the pasture and looked at the grass and started planning the next phase. The Tamworth pigs came in the spring of 2016. Tamworths are one of the oldest British heritage breeds, a long, lean, ginger-colored animal with a remarkable ability to thrive on pasture in a way that commercial breeds cannot. They root, they forage, they graze. They require infrastructure that commercial pork production doesn't: real space, real rotation, access to woods and rough ground where they can express the full range of their foraging behavior. They are, by every standard of industrial agriculture, inefficient. By the standard of what Maren was building, they were exactly right. She bought 2 gilts and a boar from a small breeder in Barren County, a woman named Patrice Sims who had been raising Tamworths quietly for a decade and who, when Maren called to introduce herself, said immediately and without formality, "Good." I was wondering when somebody in Barren County was going to do something serious. Patrice became the second person in Maren's corner. She was a straightforward woman in her mid-50s with opinions about pig nutrition that she delivered at full volume and without apology, and she drove down to Maren's farm twice that first season to look at the pasture rotation and say with satisfaction, each time, that it was working better than she'd expected. The pigs changed the land in ways Maren had read about but hadn't quite believed until she saw it. The areas where they worked, the rough corners of the farm, the edges of the woodlot, the low ground along the creek where nothing had grown well in years, began to recover. The soil broke open. The grass came back thicker. The cattle, 3 steers she'd added on a handshake arrangement with Harold Tate, who agreed to take payment after sale, moved through the rotation behind the sheep and in front of the pigs, and the whole system began to pulse with a kind of productive rhythm that she had imagined for 3 years but was still somehow surprising to witness. There was a man who drove slowly past her front gate that summer. A dark blue pickup truck, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, slowing to look at the pastures from the road. She knew who it was before she confirmed it. Dale Hauser, the county extension agent who had drawn on his whiteboard and declined to look at her folder. She didn't wave. She kept working. She did note that he slowed down every single time. By the fall of 2016, her gross income from direct farm sales had reached $42,000. This was not yet sustainable, her expenses were real and the infrastructure still needed investment, but it was real money from real sales to real buyers who had started coming back with a consistency that told her the product was right. The restaurant group in Bowling Green had begun buying lamb on a monthly schedule. A butcher shop in Glasgow had taken a standing order for Tamworth pork. A farmer's market in Bowling Green where she had rented a booth that summer had produced something she hadn't entirely expected, a waiting list. People wanted more than she could produce. She drove to the Farm Credit Office in the fall of 2016. Not to see Lon Breckett, who had given her the one-word denial 2.5 years earlier. She asked specifically for a different officer, a woman named Janet Colby who had joined the office the previous spring and who had a reputation, Maren had done her research, for reading actual numbers before forming opinions. Janet Colby read the folder. Every page of it. She asked 4 questions, each one specific, each one demonstrating that she had understood what she was reading. She approved a $15,000 operating line of credit before Maren had finished her coffee. Walking out of that office into the Glasgow afternoon, Maren did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific relief of being taken seriously by one person with authority, which is a smaller feeling than vindication but more immediately useful. The $15,000 went to fencing. Specifically to a permanent interior lane system, what serious graziers call a laneways design, that allowed her to move animals between paddocks without stress and without the daily inefficiency of temporary electric fencing she'd been using since the beginning. Harold Tate helped her set posts for 2 weekends in October, and when they finished the last section and she walked the full lane from the barn to the far corner of the north pasture, Harold stood at the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at what they'd built and said nothing for a while. "Your grandmother's going to like this," he finally said. Celia Fay walked the full laneway system the following Sunday, slowly, with her cane, stopping at each intersection to look at the paddocks. She didn't say much. But she ran her hand along one of the cedar posts as she passed it, the way you touch something you want to remember. Maren watched her grandmother walk that lane and understood something she hadn't fully understood before. The land remembered. Not in any mystical sense, in the plain physical sense that soil holds the record of what has been done to it, and good land management is legible in the ground the way good care is legible in a face. What Celia Fay was touching when she touched that post was the evidence that someone had taken the farm seriously. That it wasn't ending. But the winter of 2016 into 2017 brought the first real crisis. It began with a phone call in December from the processing facility she had been using, a small USDA-inspected plant in Edmonton, Kentucky, 40 minutes from the farm. They were closing. January 15th. The owner, a man named Gary Purvis, had been dealing with equipment failures and a regulatory notice and had made the decision quietly over Thanksgiving and was calling his customers in the first week of December to let them know. Maren stood in the kitchen and listened to Gary Purvis explain this, and when he finished she thanked him for calling personally and hung up and sat down at the table. Without a USDA-inspected facility, she could not legally sell processed meat to restaurants or retail. The Glasgow Butcher Shop, the Bowling Green restaurant accounts, the farmers market sales, all of it required inspection certification that she could only get through an approved facility. The next nearest plant was in Campbellsville, 63 miles away and already running close to capacity. She called them that afternoon. They were booked through March. She called 6 other facilities across a 200-mile radius over the next 3 days. 2 were closed. 2 were full. 1 was technically available but was not equipped for small ruminant processing. 1 would see her in February. February was too late. She had commitments. She had customers who were counting on product in January and February, and if she failed to deliver now, at this particular stage of building trust, she knew what that meant for the relationships she had spent 3 years developing. She pulled out her laptop and started a different kind of search. She had read, 2 years earlier, about a provision in Kentucky agriculture law regarding on-farm processing for direct sales, a pathway that existed for small producers to legally process and sell a limited volume of product directly to end consumers without full USDA plant certification, under specific conditions. She had read about it academically. She had not intended to use it, because the restaurant and retail channel was where the real margin lived. She was up until 2 in the morning reading Kentucky Administrative Regulations, Title 302, the sections governing meat processing and direct farm sales. She called the Kentucky Department of Agriculture at 8 o'clock the next morning and asked to speak with someone in the meat division and spent 45 minutes on the phone going through the specific requirements. It was legal. It was limited, she could not sell through restaurants under this provision, only direct to individual customers. But it was legal. And it was a bridge. She spent the next 3 weeks building a processing area in the barn that met state requirements. She called her customers, every one of them, and explained the situation with the directness she had always used with them. The restaurant group was disappointed. The butcher shop was sympathetic but clear, they needed a certified supply chain. She understood. She told them she would be back in March when the Campbellsville facility had space. She redirected every animal she had scheduled for January and February to direct customer sales, cutting out the middleman entirely. She called the waiting list from her farmer's market booth. She drove to Glasgow and left cards at the hardware store and the feed store and the library community board. She set up a simple order system through email. 31 individual customers placed orders in January. 47 in February. The margin per pound was actually higher than the restaurant channel. This was the moment, she would recognize it later, when the shape of the business changed. She had been building something designed to move product through established channels because that was what she had studied and planned. The processing plant crisis stripped that away and forced her into a model she hadn't intended, and what she found there was something that fit the land and fit her life better than what she'd been building toward. She did not abandon the restaurant accounts when Campbellsville opened up in March. She kept them, because they provided volume and predictability. But she began to understand that the direct customer relationship was the irreplaceable thing. When someone drove 30 minutes from Bowling Green to pick up a whole Tamworth shoulder that they had pre-ordered by name, from a specific animal they knew had been raised on a specific piece of land, that transaction carried a weight that no distributor account could hold. People wanted to know the farm. She had not expected that. She had expected to sell product. She began, instead, to sell belonging. It started with a small thing. She began writing a short note with each direct order. Not a marketing letter. Just a note. What the week had looked like. Which paddock the animals had been in. Whether it had rained. Something specific and true from the actual days of that particular week on that particular farm. She wrote the notes by hand at first, then typed them because her handwriting was, as she described it, agricultural at best. She kept them to one page, sometimes less. Customers started writing back. And here is where the story shifts in a way that even Maren didn't see coming. In the spring of 2017, a woman named Ruth Alderman sent back a note with her second order. Ruth was 60-something, a retired schoolteacher from Glasgow who had grown up on a farm in Cumberland County and who had bought 2 pounds of Katahdin ground lamb from Maren's market booth on a Saturday in October almost on a dare to herself, because she hadn't cooked lamb since her mother died. Ruth wrote 3 paragraphs about what it had tasted like. Not the flavor exactly, though she got to that, but the memory that had come with it. The specific memory of her mother's kitchen on a fall evening and the smell of the fat rendering in the cast iron skillet and the way the whole house had felt inhabited in a way houses sometimes stop feeling when someone who knew how to fill them is gone. Maren read that letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table next to the accountant's letter, though that letter was still 4 years away from being written. She looked at both pieces of paper, one with someone's grief on it, one blank, and she felt the weight of what she had stumbled into. She was not selling protein. She was not even selling a pasture management system, though the pasture management system was real and sound and working. She was selling continuity. She was selling a specific thread of connection to a way of living on the land that was disappearing, and the people who came to her market booth and wrote back to her notes and drove out Tompkinsville Road to pick up their orders were holding that thread because they could feel it thinning everywhere else. That recognition changed how she talked about the farm. She started using the breed names deliberately in her notes and at the market. Katahdin. Tamworth. Ossabaw. These were not marketing words, they were the actual names of actual animals with actual histories, and she found that people were hungry for that specificity. They were tired of meat that came from nowhere, from some generalized protein system with no name and no face and no 47 acres of limestone underlaying Kentucky pasture. The specificity was the point. The specificity was what they were paying for. She added Ossabaw Island hogs in the fall of 2017. Ossabaws are one of the oldest feral-derived American breeds, descended from Spanish pigs brought to Ossabaw Island off the Georgia coast in the 16th century, left there, allowed to adapt for 400 years to a lean and variable food supply, and consequently carrying a genetic history and a flavor profile that no commercial breed comes close to matching. They are small, slow-growing, and produce lard and pork with a richness that chefs specifically seek out when they know it exists. Patrice Sims had connections to an Ossabaw breeder in Tennessee. Maren drove down in September, evaluated 2 gilts and a small boar, loaded them into the trailer, and brought them home through a warm evening that smelled of goldenrod and cut hay. She integrated them carefully. Ossabaws don't mix well with Tamworths in confined spaces, but on real pasture with real acreage they establish distance and coexist without serious conflict. She gave them the woodland edge and the creekside rough ground, the areas her Tamworths had already opened up, and they took to it with the competence of animals that had been handling marginal ground for centuries. The first Ossabaw pork she sold, in March of 2018, went to a restaurant in Nashville. The chef had heard about her through the Bowling Green account, made the drive up on a Tuesday to see the farm, and stood in the woodlet watching the Ossabaws root through the leaf litter with an expression that Maren recognized as the look of someone whose problem has just been solved. He bought everything she had available and asked for a standing arrangement. By the end of 2017, gross revenue had reached $119,000. Expenses were still significant: processing, feed supplementation in winter, the Campbellsville facility fees, the mortgage she had taken on a small addition to the barn, but the operation was profitable. Genuinely, sustainably profitable. Wallace Greer, her accountant in Glasgow, had been doing her book since the beginning and had watched the numbers with a quiet professional attention that, over time, had acquired a quality she could only describe as rooting interest. In the spring of 2018, a small thing happened that was actually not small at all. Lon Breckett, the loan officer who had said denied to her in March of 2014, walked up to her booth at the Bowling Green Farmers Market on a Saturday morning in April. He had a young woman with him who was clearly his daughter, college age, home for the weekend. He stopped at the display of Tamworth and Ossabaw cuts and looked at the prices and looked at the sign with the farm name, and then he looked at Maren. She looked at him. He bought 2 rib chops and a package of Ossabaw lard, and he said, with the stiff courtesy of a man who knows he owes something he doesn't quite know how to pay, "Nice operation you built out there." Maren took his money and gave him his change and said, "Thank you for stopping by." She did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying. The chops cost $14 a pound. The lard was $7.50. He paid without flinching. Harold Tate had a mild stroke in June of 2018, which slowed him but didn't stop him, and he took to sitting on the fence at the edge of the north paddock on summer evenings watching the rotation cycle through. Maren brought him coffee on those evenings sometimes, and they sat together without needing to talk, which was the most comfortable conversation either of them had. The farm, by then, had the quality that good land acquires when it's been treated well for several years running, a kind of coherence. The grass was thicker and more diverse than it had been in 2014. The waterways ran clear after rain rather than carrying topsoil. The animals moved through their rotation with the easy indifference of creatures in the right environment, and that ease, that fluency between animal and land, was visible to anyone who knew how to look. Harold looked. He knew. "Your grandmother's father would have understood this," he said one evening, and Maren recognized this as the highest thing Harold Tate was capable of saying to anyone. The Nashville restaurant account led to 2 more restaurant relationships by the fall of 2018, one in Lexington, one in Louisville, both chef-driven places where the sourcing story was as important as the product itself. The Louisville chef, a woman named Angela Carr, drove down in October, spent half a day walking the farm with Maren, and went home and put the farm's name on her menu next to the Tamworth pork belly. That listing, those 2 words, the farm's name on a printed menu in a restaurant that Louisville food writers paid attention to, produced something Maren had not anticipated. Press. A food writer from Louisville contacted her in November. Then a regional agricultural magazine. Then a features journalist who was working on a piece about women operating heritage breed farms in the Upper South. Maren did the interviews carefully, choosing her words with the same deliberateness she brought to everything else, neither selling herself nor deflecting. She talked about the land. She talked about the breeds. She talked about the rotation system and what it had done to the pasture quality over 4 years. She talked about Celia Fay's father starting with 6 ewes. She did not talk about Dale Hauser. She did not talk about the whiteboard or the folder or the word denied. Not because she had forgotten, she hadn't, but because the story she was telling was about the land and the animals and the people who had shown up, not the people who hadn't. The magazine piece ran in January of 2019 under the headline, South Central Kentucky's Quiet Revolution in Heritage Grazing. Maren read it at the kitchen table and allowed herself, briefly, to feel something like satisfaction, not pride exactly, but the specific quiet that comes when the record is set straight by someone who did the reporting. And then it was March of 2019. And then there was an envelope on the kitchen table with a broken wax seal. The letter from Wallace Greer showed the final 2018 figures, $280,412 gross revenue. After expenses, processing fees, breeding stock costs, barn mortgage, equipment maintenance, winter hay from Harold Tate's operation, infrastructure, the net was not $280. But it was a number Maren could live on with dignity and invest from with confidence, and it was a number that had grown by more than 30% from the prior year, with the trajectory pointing clearly in one direction. She knew who had been at the kitchen table that morning before she was up. She put her boots back on, still muddy from the 4:30 feeding, and walked across the frost-stiff yard to the small apartment over the barn that she had built 2 summers ago, a simple room with its own entrance that she had offered to Dale Hauser in the fall of 2018 when he had reached out, cautiously, to tell her that he had recommended her operation to a young woman planning a heritage breed enterprise in Adair County, and could she possibly speak with her? She had said yes to that. And when Dale Hauser had mentioned, with the awkwardness of a man saying something he had been rehearsing, that he had been wrong in 2014 and that he thought she should know that, she had accepted this without making anything of it. She had offered him the apartment over the barn as a place to stay, because he had recently gone through a divorce and was temporarily between situations, and because she had decided at some point, she couldn't name exactly when, that holding the ledger of who owed whom what was less interesting than keeping the farm going. Dale Hauser had been living in that apartment since November. He helped with the early morning feedings. He was better with the sheep than he expected to be. He was learning, slowly and without credit, what the folder he hadn't read had actually contained. Maren knocked on his door. He opened it in his barn coat, already dressed, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. He looked at her face and looked at the envelope she was holding. "I'm sorry," he said. "I heard you come in and I saw it on the table and I..." She handed him the letter. Not to show him the number again. He'd already seen the number. She handed it to him so he could read what Wallace Greer had written at the bottom, in his own handwriting, in the plain ink of a man who had watched 31 years of farm accounts pass through his office. "I've been doing this work for 31 years and I want you to know I've never been happier to sign my name." Dale Hauser read it. He read it again. His hands moved slightly around the coffee cup. "You knew it would work," he said. Not as a question. Maren looked out past him at the pasture, where the Katahdin ewes were moving in the gray morning light, pulling at the frost-stiffened grass with the patient, unhurried attention of creatures in their right place. "The land knew," she said. "I just didn't argue with it." She took the letter back. She refolded along its lines. She walked back to the kitchen and set it on the table next to her coffee and stood at the window watching her ewes for a while. Outside, the frost was beginning to let go of the grass as the morning light found it. The Tamworths in the near paddock were moving toward their feeder in the particular unhurried way that healthy pigs move, heavy and deliberate and completely without doubt. The Ossabaws were still in the woodlet, visible only as shapes in the shadow of the trees, but she knew they were there. She knew each of them by their movement, their temperament, the specific way each animal had of inhabiting its ground. She thought about Ruth Alderman's letter, which she still had somewhere in the drawer of the kitchen desk. The one about the cast iron skillet and the mother's kitchen and the smell of rendering fat on a fall evening. She thought about Celia Fay's hand on the cedar post. She thought about Harold Tate sitting on the fence in the summer evening with his coffee growing cold, watching the rotation move through the north paddock with the slow confidence of something right. She thought about the woman in Adair County that Dale Hauser had sent to her, a 28-year-old named Dara, who had driven down in January with her own manila folder full of research and had sat at the same kitchen table and spread her plans out with the careful hands of someone who expected to be told no. Maren had not told her no. She had read every page of the folder. She had asked 5 questions. She had told Dara 3 things she would need to change and 1 thing she had gotten exactly right that most people get wrong, and she had given her Patrice Sim's phone number, and she had walked her out to the pasture to see the rotation in action, and Dara had stood at the fence in January looking at the ewes and the hogs in the far corner of the woodlot and had breathed out slowly the way you breathe when something you were only 90% sure existed turns out to be real. How long did it take? Dara had asked. Maren thought about it honestly. 5 years to the number that made sense. 2 years before that to build what the number could rest on. Dara nodded. She had the look of someone recalculating, but not deterred. The first 2 years are the land, Maren said. You're working for the land then, not for yourself. If you can hold on through that, the land starts working with you. This is what nobody had told her in 2014. This is what the whiteboard and the styrofoam coffee cup and the folding chair and the word denied had failed entirely to account for, that the farm's productivity was not a fixed quantity waiting to be unlocked by capital input. The farm was a living system that responded to attention over time, that became progressively more capable the better it was understood and the more carefully it was managed. The first year of rotational grazing did not produce what the 5th year produced. The soil that had been compacted and depleted by a decade of overgrazing did not perform in 2014 the way it performed in 2019. The relationship between Maren and her land was not a business transaction. It was closer to what happens between a musician and an instrument over years of practice, each shaped by the other, each more capable in the presence of the other than either would be apart. The Katahdin ewes at the gate knew her footfall. They heard her boots on the gravel before she reached the fence and they oriented toward her with the easy familiarity of animals that had been handled gently and consistently since the day they arrived. The lead ewe, a 5-year-old Maren had named Celia in a moment of sentiment she didn't bother to disguise, had a way of standing slightly ahead of the others that was not dominance exactly but something quieter, a composure that the others organized themselves around. Maren had purchased Celia in the summer of 2014 for $225 at the Metcalfe County sale. Celia had produced 31 lambs over 5 lambing seasons. She had been in every paddock on the farm, had walked every lane in every season, had been the first animal through every new gate Maren had built. The farm was visible in Celia's body the way the farm was visible in the soil and the grass and the clear running waterways, as a record of what had been done here, carefully, over years. Maren opened the gate. The ewes moved through with their characteristic patience, clustering briefly at the entrance and then spreading into the fresh paddock with the purposeful, lowered head attention of animals finding their breakfast. Celia moved to the far corner of the paddock where the grass was tallest and began to graze without hurry, without anxiety, without any awareness that she was the living evidence of something that once was called impossible. The frost was gone from the grass now. The light on the Barren County hills had gone from gray to pale gold, and the farm was fully visible in it, the laneways and the paddocks and the barn with its new addition and the apartment over it where Dale Hauser was drinking his coffee, and the woodlot where the Ossabaws moved in the shadows, and the far fence line where Harold Tate's land began, and the entire system of fences and waterways and soil amendments and carefully managed rotations that Maren had built over 5 years on 47 acres that a county agent had once told her could not support what she was asking of him. The land had known better. Maren had simply listened. Wallace Greer's letter was on the kitchen table. The wax seal was broken. The number at the bottom was 280,000.